Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to be doing my 14.18 mid-lane tier list. So if you're for content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There are a couple of changes this patch, mostly focused about worlds. Obviously this is the worlds patch, so there were many shifts around to try and balance out some of the champions there, whether that was overswings, things like Corki, Fleet, Zeri, Smolder all being nerfed, Azir, another one actually, and then a couple of things being buffed up. We had Ahri, Hui, Jace and Malphite obviously kind of indirectly for mid lane. We've had some other adjustments. Melee Fleet obviously got buffed. Nasus got nerfed. That's a pretty big one, as Nasus was beginning to see quite consistent play in the mid lane. But let's cover the changes. So the D tier is going to consist of the same champions as last time. We have Corki, who is probably deserving of his own tier at this point. He is sat at something like a 41% win rate in solo queue at the moment, which drops all the way down to 38% when you hit like 15 minutes, or the 15 to 20 bracket, which is the lowest I think I've ever seen someone's win rate for their primary role after like significant time after a release or in a certain balance state for like the last couple of years. That is absurd to see. The champion's in a really, really bad spot for the average player, and honestly I still think it might see some playing competitive, which is surprising because I do think pros should have hopped off this champion maybe a nerf ago. The Q nerf will probably seal the deal for this patch, but yeah, this champion's really underperforming now. It's had a lot of damage stripped off of it, but primarily base damages more than anything. That Q damage has gone all the way down to 250 at max rank now, I believe, which is very low for your primary wave clear tool. And yeah, the champion's in a pretty rough spot. It might get reworked again, who knows, but yeah, Corki, gonna be in my D tier, a very, very hard locked D tier pick at the moment. Varus got nerfed this patch. He was like, if you build him like lethality, he could actually climb the tier list a bit, but the nerfs to his AD ratio on both Q and E this patch have really secured him as a spot in the D tier as well at the moment. He sits higher than some of the other picks here, actually, but yeah, still a D tier pick in his current state. The nerfs did take him down quite a substantial amount. Lucian got nerfed pretty aggressively from the changes back along to like buff up his passive, which has no effect on mid lane, and the nerf down to his Q, which really does hurt its wave clear and trading ability quite substantially. It does also solidify him as a pretty pretty deep D tier pick. Caitlyn, obviously that one's pretty self-explanatory. Tristana, I mean, for Caitlyn, she was never really a good mid laner. She was kind of like being brought up because so many of the other AD mid laners were beginning to see play. Tristana has pretty heavily been nerfed because of her dominance in the mid lane. She is being reworked in 14.19, but yeah, for the moment, definitely underperforming as well. Zeri had her passive aggressively nerfed this patch, like very aggressively, to the point where she doesn't actually see that much play in the mid lane. So she, I mean, I'll have her in the D tier for this patch, but she will probably get removed next patch. She yeah, she does underperform quite aggressively as well now. Ezreal, one of the more popular ones in his current state, probably one of the better ones as well, but still underperforming. I would recommend going to Kaiser over Ezreal if you're looking for something with a bit more artillery. But if you want that, I mean, if you want some physical damage in the mid lane, then Ezreal is still a very solid option, but for average solo queue, not something I would really recommend in his current state. Smolder got nerfed this patch quite aggressively as well. I'd recommend trying different build variations. They took the AP ratio off the Q, which does hurt quite a bit when you're going like the Liandry, the Cosmic Drive variants, the Riftmaker variants, so it's worth looking around at some other builds, but yeah, he's now pretty underperforming alongside the Fleet nerfs. Azir got nerfed really aggressively this patch. His W lost a lot of power early on to the game. He is one of the weakest, if not just outright the weakest early game primarily mid laner in at the moment. Yeah, they've siphoned a lot of power out of this champion, whether that was through the Q back along, which was a very, very aggressive wave clear and harass tool, and then now they've taken a lot of power of the early game W, hurting his ability to consistently trade with you. His champion's in a really rough spot again, and yeah, he sits within the D tier. The C tier is going to consist of relatively similar champions as well. We have Kaiser, who is primarily going the artillery variant. If you get the items online for this build, it can be quite oppressive in the game, and if you have the setup and the tools around you, maybe you're playing with like a duo, then there is definitely space for this pick to have a lot more power than I'd say some of the D tier champions have. Like, the D tier champions in a way can all function once you get late enough into the game, but they've had had a lot of power siphoned out of either early game systems, but that being runes and stuff, early game items being like Doran's Blade and some of the marksman items, and like there are individual kits just being nerfed down early on. In Kai'Sa's case, she hasn't really been nerfed. I mean, I don't think she's been nerfed directly. I think actually her last change was a direct buff to her. I believe it was a buff to her Q. But since then, she also had the R range buff, which doesn't really do a huge amount, but that was also something she did receive more recently when some of the other changes. But yeah, Kai'Sa, primarily going like the Mana Mune, Lunan's Companion, Horizon Focus build, I believe that is, playing around her artillery. Kassadin has been underperforming for a while. Obviously, the changes which he received, the nerfs which he received going into the split, have just left him in a pretty rough spot, and yeah, he's been in the C tier for like the last 8 patches or something. Kiana got readjusted, and the changes were fairly power neutral, but she is obviously a very elite skewed pick, very dominant in high elo. For mid elo, just something I wouldn't really recommend unless you're willing to sink a lot of time into learning this champion really well. Kind of akin to Zoe in a way. Zoe doesn't quite have as aggressive of an elite curve, but she still does have that depth to her, making sure you're rotating your W correctly, like when you're like picking up some of the spells within fights, making sure you're landing your sleeps and like you're comboing off them effectively. All that can be quite important to like actually utilizing this pick and making sure she's doing damage. If you're not fishing for these picks, then this champion loses a lot of its value. And it has okay wave clear. It tends to be pretty gold reliant, her wave clear, but predominantly more popular in the East. But yeah, she still definitely has power to her. Kind of slept on as a pick at the moment, but still going to be within my C tier. Katarina, Riot obviously really messed around with this champion a bit, and I know a lot of Katarina mains weren't really happy with the direction they took her in. She went from like C tier to A tier with some of like the build variations, because they were a bit easier to operate, and she did gain a bit of power, but then the nerfs brought her back down to the C tier, and yeah, I wouldn't really recommend learning Katarina unless, once again, you are willing to sink a lot of time into this champion. Champions moving down, we have Ziggs. So Ziggs got enough to his passive, but was already pretty on like low B tier pick for average solo queue. He does obviously have decent artillery, not quite, I'd say, the same level of range as something like a Xerath or consistency. A lot of that comes down to making sure you're doing damage off the wave as Ziggs, and like you're playing around your passive, and it kind of requires you to be a bit more in auto range, which Xerath, even though he does have the passive, which obviously allows him to get a bit more mana return, he doesn't really need to use it as much as someone like Ziggs, who actually gains a decent amount of damage through it. The nerfs obviously hurts his siege potential, and it drops him from like a low B tier to like a C tier pick. He's still probably going to see playing competitive as dominantly a bot laner, but might see some play mid if like APA is still willing to pick the champion. Zed is also going to drop down. The pick's been on the downfall ever since it got adjusted. They took some power away from its late game and gave it back to it for its laning phase, which obviously helps elite Zed. Zed is probably a bit stronger there now, but in average play, yeah, lost a bit of power, so he drops from the low B tier to the C tier. Moving up, we have Orianna, who I probably should have moved up in the previous patch when she received the 5% AP ratio buff on Q. She's doing a bit better with that, and yeah, deserving of a B tier spot. Jace got buffed this patch, and the changes were enough to push him up. I think Jace mid is genuinely a really solid pick, and a lot more people should be playing him, especially if like the reason why you're playing, if you're playing Jace because you enjoy him and you're playing him top lane, has stronger counter picks, things like Malphite, things like I'm blanking here, but yeah, there are pretty rough matchups for Jace in the top lane, which tend to be some of the more common ones. In the mid lane, you still have access to the same level of runes, whether it's like the Phase Rush, the First Strikes, the Aries, the Conquerors, the Electrocutes, which tends to be one of the more dominant ones in the mid lane. There's a lot of tools for you there, and the buffs helps his utility output, puts him up to the B tier. Still has some good lethality options accessible to him, whether that's like Opportunity or Yomu's here. Yasuo jumps to the B tier. The buffs to Fleet this patch for melee champions did enough to put him back up as like a really solid counter pick. Can't really blind Yasuo. There are once again a lot of champions which can kind of answer him, and he tends to be better in situations where you're playing into a lot of range and you can really utilize the power of your damage and your wind wall. If you're able to find those angles, you're able to pair off teammates, then yeah, this pick can still be really valuable in a lot of games. Akali sits on the low side of the B tier at the moment. She also got adjusted to be a bit more elite skewed, and the changes obviously once again were slightly down for average elo, so she drops towards the bottom of the B tier. Primarily, I mean, she did benefit from Shadow Flame and Storm Surge being buffed this patch. She does like these items, but she also has things like Lich Bane and Rocket Belt accessible to her, so you can kind of flex around your build options there. Akshan has been underperforming, primarily because of the marksman system just being nerfed down and he being directly impacted by this. BT being nerfed this patch, another hit to Akshan, combined with Fleet being nerfed, looking at PTA as his main keystone option. Overall, I just wouldn't really recommend Akshan. He is also pretty elite skewed in his current state. I do think they might change him at some point, as he is a pretty unpopular pick in his current state. Fizz has been on the weaker side for a while. He sits as like a low B tier option as well. Once again, he's primarily just played by OTPs, but he does have some sharp matchups where if you're consistently able to land your R and utilize your E to either dive or just output a lot of damage, things like ASL can be really vulnerable to this matchup, then he can be quite strong. I wouldn't really recommend playing Fizz as like a blind pick, as yeah, once again, there are a lot of champions which can quite comfortably answer him and really mitigate his ability to snowball in the game. Aurelia got a bit weaker with the ball changes and also had akin to Akali slight elite skew buffs. Talon is probably just the mid B tier pick at the moment. He got a bunch of quality of life changes which did help him, and obviously allows him to do some funky stuff, whether that's like flashing with Q to like redirect and utilizing that to find unique kill angles. There are other things which obviously he has benefited from, but he still sits as like a mid B tier option. I'd be interested to see if they like try to do something to his W to enable him to be a bit better in jungle as well as in the mid lane, as I know kind of like a mix of players of this champion at the moment which do enjoy him in both roles, or whether they go down like a bruiser route, whether they want him to start opting into some more bruiser items, because I know bruiser talent in the past has also been a relatively popular thing, albeit some of the mains weren't a huge fan because they prefer the obviously assassin nature of the champion. Ari moves up to the A tier, so I'll talk about her in a second. Cho'Gath sits as a high B tier. His pick definitely has a level of power to it, as like a stat stick in the mid lane. It can also just nullify and shut down a lot of champions, whether that's through like W max, E max, Q max, going grass, going comet. There's loads of different paths you can take with this champion, and he's in a pretty good spot. I would recommend picking him up as like a niche option which you can sometimes opt into. Yone sits at the top of my B tier. I would really like to put Yone and Yasuo as like A tier picks. I do believe Yasuo probably is a bit more locked in the B tier. Yone is more generalistic and scales a bit better. But they tend to be pretty elite skewed. I mean, a lot of high skill champions in the mid lane are obviously going to be elite skewed. That is just by nature of the champion. The better you are at the pick, the higher you're more likely to be when the champion has a high mastery curve. The likes of Rammus, obviously not a mid lane example, has a pretty low mastery curve. You can put like 10 games into this champion and unlock most of the potential of the pick. But yeah, Yone sits towards the higher end of the B tier. Morgana, also within my B tier, she could probably also sit in the A tier, kind of akin to Yone, but she obviously falls short with the consistency side of things. If you're not able to land your Q consistently without like setup, then this champion definitely does get punished by it. But it makes sure the mid lane Morgana makes use of her W, which can be a really good ability for obviously jungle and mid lane when you are using it to wave clear and using it to deal damage to enemy champions. There are definitely things which can be valuable to on this pick, but her ult really doesn't match with the play style of the champion, and that definitely causes some problems, and she really struggles to push higher than B tier, even if her kit is inherently in a strong spot because of some of its weaknesses, which it does have. Rise moves up to the A tier. Actually, I'll talk about Aurora first. So Aurora drops down to the B tier. She lost power from the Narcissus patch. Her ult got reduced in duration across the board, combined with the fact that she can no longer jump over big walls. There was a level of power loss there, so she once again drops from A tier to the B tier. She kind of flip-flops because over time people will continue to learn the champion, has a relatively high mastery curve, and it wouldn't surprise me if it jumps back up to the A tier, it might get nerfed again. So be aware, if you sink time into Aurora, you're still probably going to have a good time, as this champion will, scale pretty aggressively with the games you put into it. Other champions dropping down, we have Vladimir. Once again, it's the fucking Grasp Vladimir variation. Like, it's not something you can default on, and I know a lot of people think it's really obnoxious and overpowered, which can be quite frustrating in laning phase, especially when you pull off the wave, but it doesn't scale as well, and oftentimes your mid game can fall kind of short. You don't really have as much kill potential on people. There's weaknesses to it, and there are strengths to it, obviously. Riot are aware of this variation and are nerfing it in 14.19, but yeah, I wouldn't really default on it, and if anything, I wouldn't really play it if you're not really comfortable with changing your playstyle if you've already sunk time into Vladimir. Overall, this pick drops from the A tier to the B tier. It's still an A tier pick if you're going like your Phase Rush, your Airy, AP variations, but don't default on Grasp. It has its places. Yeah. The other champion moving down. Actually, no, there are no other champions moving down. Yeah, okay, so A tier then. We have Ahri and Ryze moving up. In Ahri's case, she got an E buff this patch. It did enough to push her back up. Obviously, it's going to be a bit more late game skewed, and you should. Well, it's going to be a bit more mid game skewed now. You're going to start maxing E instead of W second, which is nice. I believe that is probably a better spot for the champion to be in, and it was 40 more damage on an ability like that is pretty big, especially alongside the AP ratio buff. Yeah, deserving of an A tier spot. She has good mobility. Once again, her damage is up, so she's in a pretty good spot. Ryze, I think Ryze has been slept on for a while at this point, but he's obviously very unpopular. But good wave clear, good damage, scales pretty well, has a decent early. He has pretty strong auto attacks. People sleep on this for the most part. But yeah, the pick's in a better spot now, especially with the buffs. Deserving of a low A tier spot, in my opinion. Where you got buff this patch, he also sits. He's going to continue to sit in the A tier. The buff was very minimal. If anything, it was more targeted towards support way, which I'll talk about when I do my support tier list. But TLDR, it does just convert to a tiny bit of power in the mid lane. If anything, it looks just kind of placebo, but it's fair. It's nice. Victor sits within my A tier. Slept on champion, kind of akin to Ryze. Obviously, he can be a bit slow to come online in situations, but this pick still has decent power and can be a lane bully in situations, especially if you get an early kill from an invade or you get some sort of help from your jungler. There can definitely be a lot of power unlocked through this pick. Vilcors slept on mid laner as well. This champion primarily obviously played as a support, still has a decent amount of power in the mid lane. Nico, very unpopular. One of the most unpopular mid laners in the game. That was her primary role. Pretty strong as a support. I think support Nico is actually pretty slept on to a degree. Does have a bit of a skill curve. I mean, Nico generalistically does. If you've watched APA and LS talk about Nico more recently, you'll know of some of the mechanics this champion has and how game warping they can be, and 99.9% of people won't even know that these exist. So I'd recommend sitting down, learning Nico if you do enjoy the champion. If you don't, probably not really worth sinking time into a champion you don't really enjoy, who is like a mid A tier pick at best. But obviously does have potential, but yeah, sits within my A tier for the moment. LeBlanc got nerfed. She now sits as like a mid A tier option. She's still very good in situations where you can utilize her AP burst and you're playing alongside an AD jungler, which are obviously going to be more popular and prevalent this patch with the buffs towards the likes of Jarvan, Xin Zhao, Viego. So yeah, LeBlanc should be in a better spot this patch compared to last patch with her nerfs, but still going to be an A tier pick. Pantheon. I'm kind of going off Pantheon at the moment. I think the champion's obviously one of the best introductions to an AD mid lane bully. It can be really impressive in certain matchups, but he's also kind of falling short later. I mean, he falls very short later into the game. He falls off very aggressively, which is honestly surprising. He doesn't see competitive play because early game dominant champions tend to be more competitive skewed. Pantheon's also not really played that much in Elite either, which is also kind of surprising. This champion obviously can function mid, support, top lane, jungle. He has a lot of roles accessible to him, so he's a great flex pick, but he's a bit on the weak side. He sits as like a low A tier champion, low A tier pick, because he's probably one of the best. He's one of the easiest early game bullies, which hasn't already been nerfed into the ground because of their competitive dominance. So Pantheon, don't sleep on him, but he's also I think I also had him slightly overrated. Renekton. Now, Renekton mid is very good into specific matchups, whether that's Yone, Yasuo, and some of the other AD Assassin matchups, which he can quite comfortably just steamroll. This champion, if you like, you can sometimes alternate between W and E max as like secondaries. W max can be really oppressive in certain situations. Like that is something people should definitely opt into a bit more, especially if you're running it alongside something like a PTA. You can obviously run it alongside the likes of Conqueror. There are different build variations accessible to him, whether it's like Stride Breaker, Eclipse, Cleaver Rush. There are different variations you can play this champion as. He's predominantly a counter pick in the mid lane, but more blindable top. Yeah, this pick's a solid A tier. Echo probably drops down towards the low end of the A tier at the moment. If there are two champions which I was like, I'm a bit more considering moving or like dropping down, it's probably Echo or Pantheon. Echo's kind of power comes from the fact that he's not a very common mid laner, and people oftentimes just disrespect his level 1 with the E Halo Blade Scorch power, and that can oftentimes convert into a huge advantage. But if people respect it, then that is definitely going to feel quite bad. You're really reliant on snowballing, utilizing your ult to like look for picks in jungle, and like making sure you're staying relatively healthy, using your Q to just like to clear the wave pretty healthily. If you can't, but like if you're not ahead of the curve and you're forced to auto the wave, you'll be chunked quite aggressively, and yeah, that can definitely hurt the power of this pick. I'm stumbling over words. Nice. Twisted Fate. The AP variant is a bit better with the flat base damage they gave on Q. Yeah, it did enough to just keep him as like to move him up as an A tier pick. The builds obviously center around the likes of Roa, Lichbane, RFC, and then you can dabble into more like heavy AP options, or you can go a bit more utility, like self-utility, whether that's through like a Zonya or like a Banshee, and then like a Crypt Bloom or something. There are options accessible to him, but he sits as like a mid A tier pick. Syndra benefited from her R buffs. If you compile this champion well, she can be really powerful. There's a huge amount of burst damage, really benefited from Storm Surge being buffed. This champion is for sure going to see play in competitive, I don't doubt that, especially at Worlds, and I imagine we would start seeing a bit more Orianna and just Syndra a bit more generalistically. Malzahar then. So, I mean, Malzahar's dropped down a bit. I did have him in the S tier, primarily because he's just a very easy to play champion. Like, he's a great introduction, lane pushing AP mage, which can oftentimes just be a bit uncontestable, a bit unassailable, and a bit uncontestable unless you're being ganked, especially in the lower ranks. Higher up you go, people will play around your passive a lot more, and like make sure you're not able to really maintain the uptime on that, and then try and like assault you when that is down. Malzahar still obviously has a lot of things which he really benefits from, like the itemizations are better for him this split, combined with the amount of like hyper carries in the game, like popular hyper carries. His ult is a great tool for obviously shutting them down, and like Malignance can be good in those spaces, but Blackfire also a pretty solid item for him. Annie, very easy to play, obviously has some different variations. We've got like the Tibbers variation, we've got the like more durable grass bone plating E start, like kind of harass in lane variation, which can work into specific matchups. I know Ari's a pretty common one for that build, and then you just have her obviously AP burst orientated build, and yeah, she has a lot of things accessible to her. She's pretty easy to play, solid A tier champion. Vex, good counter pick. Not really played outside of those situations. I mean, the situations where you play her are obviously into high mobility picks where you can, with dashes, which you can utilize your passive to really punish them for utilizing their kits. Vex, good A tier pick into the likes of Yone, Yas, Aurelia, for example, and can definitely be quite powerful in those matchups. So obviously does have the power of Windwall, so that can hurt a bit more, but she can still function really well in that matchup, especially if he's like spamming E and being very disrespectful. Lissandra drops down a bit towards the lower end of the A tier. The nerfs is patched to her Q, her wave clear, her burst damage, and yeah, she loses a bit of power from that, but she still benefited from the buff she received in 14.17. We have Cassiopeia, who is a great counter pick. Obviously, very good into short range comps where you can utilize your ability to kite champions out. really bad into long range where you're not able to utilize your kit to its full extent. Obviously, great in 1v1 scenarios where the enemy champion doesn't have great tools to respond to you, and you're not really going to have people dodging your ultimate as frequently, especially the lower down ranks you go. If you sink a lot of time to Cassiopeia, you can definitely be rewarded for playing a pick like this. Swain and Silas wrap up the champions which remain in my A tier. So in Silas's case, he received a bunch of adjustments, and it kind of ended up being a case of now he can opt into both Bruiser and AP Burst and be pretty solid in both options. The Bruiser variant tends to be either like Roa, Protobelt, Riftmaker. There's like different options available to him there, or the Burst orientated one, which tends to be a bit more like Lichbane, Shadow Flame, and then like Storm Surge can be a solid alternative there. Overall, yeah, high-end A-tier pick, great for snowballing, and can be a really solid champion to just climb solo queue, especially if you're really good at consistently landing his abilities and like rotating correctly. Swain definitely also suffers from similar problems to Cassiopeia, where he doesn't really operate that well into long-range compositions. Obviously, his tools rely on people being close to him. His R, Q, and E are all these kind of abilities. W doesn't really match his kit as much, but can be great for scouting. And overall, Swain has been got buffed back along his Q, received like an AP ratio buff and a flat damage buff. That was like, I reckon like 10 patches ago, but that did help him, and he's remained as like as a high A, low S tier pick, and yeah, can still operate really nicely in the mid tier ranks. We've got a couple of champions left here. So Talia remains in my A tier. She got nerfed a couple of times because of her dominance in competitive, but can still definitely pump out results, especially if you once again sink a lot of time to her, and pretty reliant on snowballing as well. But yeah, there's definitely power to this pick. Nasus drops down from the S tier to the A tier. The nerf to his E this patch hurts his ability to lane against certain champions, because you're no longer really maxing that ability. You're just primarily just playing Q max Nasus, or you can play like 1.E and like you can still play like Airy and stuff like that if you don't feel comfortable running fleet, or like autoing the wave can oftentimes be pretty detrimental into certain matchups. There's still some stuff you can operate with there, but yeah, Nasus drops down from the S tier to the A tier. Malphite drops from goes up from the B tier to the A tier, but buffs this patch to him. Really good for primarily tank Malphite, but does help AP Malphite, albeit AP Malphite has consistently been a bit weaker than tank Malphite and a bit more gimmicky. Obviously, if you don't snowball with AP Malphite, that champion can feel quite rough to play in situations. So yeah, he sits as like a mid A tier option now. Viego gonna be added to my A tier. So Viego got buffed this patch. Is actually a really good mid laner. I think Viego probably sits as like a high A tier pick. I would recommend sinking time into this champion, as it is it's like going under the radar in his current state. Maybe we will see Viego mid at Worlds. There is a genuine chance that could be something people pick. I haven't really seen it in houses or scrims at the moment, but yeah, don't sleep on it. There's definitely power to this pick. If you like Viego, go ahead. Yeah, you should have a good time. Heimerdinger, I'm actually going to drop down from the S tier to the A tier. I kind of got my point across that like Heimerdinger is a really strong champion at the moment and really underrated. Do I think he actually sits amongst the S tier options? Probably not, but there is definitely power to this pick. So yeah, don't sleep on him. Brand, I'm also going to drop down from the S tier to the A tier. He has been consistently nerfed for his presence in the jungle and power in the jungle, and that just drops him from the S tier to the A tier. He is still a very good pick and can offer some of the best dot damage in the game, but he's no longer S tier worthy in my opinion. So the S tier, Quinn leads us off. Quinn is in an amazing spot for the mid lane at the moment. The Profane Hydra, Electrocute, Symbiotic Souls build is so good for her wave clear, for her burst potential, for her roaming. She just has a lot of tools accessible to her, and it's very deceptive. People don't really understand how to play against it correctly. People won't have played against it for the most part. So Quinn, very deserving of an S tier spot. We're going to have Set. I've seen some discourse around about like champions being able to kite him out, but once you have Stride Break online, you can oftentimes like just outright you can catch both those matchups through the obvious active on that ability on that item. Combined with the fact that you can oftentimes sustain through most lanes with his passive, Fleet Footwork, Jesus Christ, I'm really stumbling over words here. Not Fleet. Second Wind. D-Shield, his own passive. Set has a lot of tools to really just tank a lot of lane matchups. Conqueror is primarily going to be his main keystone. You can obviously go Stride Breaker. You can catch a lot of those matchups, which can like previously kite you out. He scales relatively well. Obviously, he's a bit more early game skewed, and doesn't obviously have the same level of accessible and point and click CC as Pantheon does on a basic ability. But his ult is a very powerful tool. He does a lot of damage. His wave clear is pretty decent, especially once you have that Tiamat passive. And yeah, great S tier pick. Garen, obviously, we all know how strong Garen is in the mid lane. I was going on about it for a long time before it really picked up in the LCK and other regions after that. But Garen mid hasn't been nerfed this patch. Nasus did. I imagine Garen will still probably see some play at Worlds. Maybe if we continue to see some Nasus. I don't know if we'll see Nasus mid. We might see some Nasus top, which we wouldn't need to obviously Garen top. But he still has great S tier solo Q pick, so he stays here. Xerath is my go-to artillery mage in the mid lane. This champion does a huge amount of damage. The ult changes really benefited him. He has loads of builds accessible to him, whether you want a bit more dot potential, whether you want a bit more burst potential. But yeah, there's options for him, like Ludens, Shadow Flame, Storm Surge. You can go like Liandry, Blackfire variants. There's different routes he can go, and yeah, very deserving of an S tier spot. Diana, incredibly deceptive pick, which is very powerful early on to the game. Most people do not understand that this champion will just outright stomp most lane matchups. You can opt into both Phase Rush, Electrocute, and I've seen some Ares and Conquerors, but yeah, it's primarily Phase Rush and Electrocute as her main two keystones. But the damage on her Q combined with the fast accessible Electrocute proc and the things you can proc alongside that, whether it's like Sudden Impact and items, whether it's like Lich Bane, Protobelt. Yeah, she's in a really good spot for the mid lane. Does fall off quite aggressively. Her ult doesn't quite have the same level of power later on into the game, especially if you're not snowballing, but this champion is still very good. Anivia, once again, an S tier pick. She's been basically S tier for like the last 2-3 seasons. Has hardly been changed. Obviously has some really strong itemization accessible to her, whether that's through durability, whether that's through just raw wave clear and damage. She's always been really powerful because of her early game wave clear. Like, Anivia is a deceptively good early game champion. Most people just don't really see her as that and see her as more as this mid game wave clearing bot, which has great control over fights, which she still does, and she does scale decently. Just yeah, her early game is deceptively strong, and people really do sleep on that. Veigar sits towards the low end of the S tier, but still a great pick. Obviously, once again, has some accessible items to him, whether that's through durability, kind of akin to Nivea. That would be like Varroa, and some of the more durable items later on into the game, Sonya, Banshee, and even some like tank items he can even dabble in. Shrelia also another option he can have. Or just raw AP burst builds, whether that's like Luden's Companion, and then just straight into Rabadons, which I'd recommend in most matchups. Like Rabadons as like a second item is great on Veigar. It allows him to do so much damage and have great wave clear and great damage in team fights. His E is also a great controlling ability. And then the other two picks are going to be my S tier. We have Asol and we have Lux. So Asol, once again, is seeing a continuous rise in play. People W-maxing second, which is correct on this pick. His E has been a pretty underwhelming ability to put points into for a while now. Overall, yeah, the champion scales incredibly aggressively, like one of the most aggressive scalers in the game, combined with having solid itemization, like Eye into Liandry, or Blackfire into like some of the other variations, like Archangel, stuff like that. I know some people like having accessible, more accessible mana pool. I don't think he needs it as much these days. Like, you can just go Eye into the Liandry and be in a pretty good spot for your mana pool, but yeah, some people do like those build variations. But overall, yeah, picks in a great spot, scales very aggressively. If you ever fall behind, this champion can feel really unassailable in most games. Lux has some of the best wave clear in the game. Her ER combo can just outright one-shot most most waves can be one-shot by Lux. Once again, I'm stumbling over words, but this pick with like Malignance, with some of the other burst options, Luna's Companion, Rabadon, Shadow Flame, Storm Surge, even this patch into like a Void. As long as you're ahead of the curve, this pick does huge amounts of damage. If you ever fall behind, this pick really does fall a bit more flat, but yeah, it has so much damage accessible to her early on to the game, combined with the E, which feels very undodgeable, especially if you don't have boots. Once you have like T1, T2s, it can be a bit more dodgeable, but yeah, if the Lux is playing correctly, rotating her passive, rotating through Qs and Es, and comboing with her ult, making sure she's getting a passive proc on that, yeah, this pick's in a really strong spot at the moment. I think she's really slept on. We've seen like high elo players picking it and having decent success as well. So yeah, Lux, don't sleep on her. And then my two S plus champions, we have Galio and we have Neferi. Neferi is the easiest to play assassin in the game. Her point and click W, her Q, which can be like a really good wave clear tool and just good amounts of damage. Her E is a simple jump, and her R gives her a stat steroid. And Neferi in a great spot at the moment. Very good for mid-elo solo Q. She is probably my go-to recommended AD pick. That and then Garen. Quinn is a bit more niche, but can still be really good, and same goes for Set in a way. But Neferi, yeah, great S to S plus pick at the moment. And Galio, I mean, Galio's been good for a while, ever since he got, like, the changes to help him be a bit more, like, buff up his more tankier build variants. That would be, like, the, like, Hollow Radiance into XYZ items, whether that's, like, a Lich Bane and then, like, more AP heavy builds or just, like, continuous raw tank. Yeah, Galio in a great spot at the moment. Oftentimes can feel really unassailable in lane, just from the get-go. Neferi tends to be his biggest counter, so if anything, I'd recommend banning that matchup, and you should be good to go against most of the other laners. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Those are my two S plus champions, which I'd recommend in most games. The S tier, all still very good options, and can have like gimmicks which can completely warp and alter the game state. And yeah, A tier, all still really good picks. It does fall off a bit more when you go down the B, C tiers, B, C, D tiers, but they all tend to be a bit more elite skewed, and that's obviously how an average mid-elo tier list is going to go. A lot of the lower picks will be predominantly elite skewed, or just weaker for the most part. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.